Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Global Connections Television is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We would invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with any type of media outlet, be it a PBS or community access television station, or perhaps it's an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you just have a website and you'd like to share our programs, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today we're going to take a look at the whole issue of arms control and nuclear non-proliferation, and my guest is an expert in this area. My guest today is Ambassador Thomas Graham. Ambassador Graham is a former senior U.S. diplomat. He is a U.S. national from Louisville, Kentucky in the United States. Ambassador Graham was involved in negotiations of every single nuclear arms and non-proliferation agreement from 1970 through 1997, which included landmark treaties such as the SALT Treaty, the START Treaty, the ABM Treaty, and many others. Ambassador Thomas Graham, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you, Bill. I'm happy to be here. Right near Louisville.
Yes, right. Or not too far from where you were born and grew up and everything else. Yes. Yeah. Well, I'm delighted you're with me today. We're going to get into these. There's so many treaties. We could do a half hour on each one.
Lots of
we'll try
acronyms.
A lot of acronyms, right? We'll skip over those as we go, or we'll go through them quickly. But to lay the groundwork, why are these international treaties so important? We're focusing on arms control and nuclear proliferation, but why are treaties so important to bring the countries of the world together to focus on these problems?
Well, at the beginning of the nuclear age, when the arms race began, there were no international controls over nuclear weapons, and the United States built 72,000 nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union built 55,000 nuclear weapons. They had everything from artillery pieces to enormous bomber weapons, and none of this was regulated. And as President Kennedy said, we need to abolish the weapons of war, he was referring to nuclear weapons, before they abolish us.
Exactly, right.
That's why.
That's for sure.
That's why they're important.
Exactly. I remember, you jog my memory, Albert Einstein, a famous scientist, said that with these nuclear weapons, they were so powerful that if we fought World War III with the nuclear weapons, he was confident that we'd be fighting World War IV with sticks and stones. And there would be nothing left.
That's the optimistic view. That assumes that some people would survive. But in an all-out thermonuclear exchange between the United States and the Soviet Union, the thousands of megatons would be exploded, which would create a huge cloud of soot and debris, which would cover the whole world. All animals or most animals and plants would die. There would be nothing to eat. There'd be radiation. It's not entirely clear that the human race would survive such a conflagration.
Exactly. We'd have a nuclear winter. They could literally blot out the sun. In a very severe form. Exactly. Well, as I mentioned, we have so many arms treaties to discuss, but let's just pick a few of them and maybe get a little overview of what they were. Let's start off with the SALT. We've heard of the Strategic Arms Limitation talks. What was the main goal of the SALT Treaty? Where was it successful? Where was it maybe not as successful?
Well, the purpose of the SALT negotiations, which was the first phase, was to try to stop the arms race, which was, just so uncontrolled, and to put a limit on the number of nuclear weapons that the United States and the Soviet Union possessed. I think it was a wholly worthwhile exercise. It came under some political attack as these treaties always seem to do. Nothing's perfect, but this was a first attempt, and I think the ABM treaty, for example, during the years it was...
This is the anti-ballistic missile?
Anti-ballistic missile treaty. It regulated the relationship between the two nuclear superpowers so as to reduce the incentive to strike first. It was stability was its objective. The other treaties, the interim agreement and the SALT II treaty, they were, as I said, to stop the arms race and put a limit on possession.
Now, that kind of leads to another one, the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. Is that what it was?
Yeah,
what was that?
The first two, the SALT treaties were brought to us by the previous administrations of Johnson, Ford, Nixon, and Carter. The START process was Ronald Reagan's administration, and it was completed, mostly completed under the George H.W. Bush administration, and it took the START process and went further and enacted reductions in these nuclear weapon forces, and significant reductions, and I think they were largely successful in reducing the number and also imposing very elaborate and intrusive controls on each side's forces. As you undoubtedly know, Ronald Reagan was very suspicious of nuclear weapons, and he proposed to President Gorbachev that the two of them abolish them all at the Reykjavik summit.
Mm-hmm. One of the challenges that we hear about, people flash back to the Cold War. They said, well, the old Soviet Union had their nuclear stockpile, they had their friends, we had our nuclear stockpile, we had our friends, but we had a sort of an agreement that we probably were not going to go to war with each other. I know there were accidents that could have occurred, we'll talk about a few of them, but today so many people are saying that you have these non-state actors, you have rogue states, you have terrorist groups, you have a lot of instability the instability we didn't have during the Cold War because you had two basic camps, the USSR and the
right.
US. Is that more of a danger today than it was back then?
Well, I don't think the danger today compares with what we faced during the Cold War. On a number of occasions, the two sides came within, I mean, it was usually one side acting, but it would have involved both sides, came within a minute or two of launching a nuclear war by mistake or accident. And I can tell you some stories that are even today rather scary. We don't have that kind of threat now, but there is a lot of international stability. The bipolar world did create more stability, perhaps in a sense. And there are areas of the world that, for the reasons you mentioned, are very worrisome. It's not as bad, but it's still very dangerous.
I remember reading that there were like 12 near accidents where we almost went to war with the Soviet Union, or they were going to go to war with us. But there was a movie made on one of those incidents.
The Man Who Saved the World.
Who was that man? How did he save the world?
His name was Colonel Stanislav Petrov, and he was the commander of an early warning station in the Soviet Union in 1983, and a new system had been installed to watch U.S. long-range missiles. He didn't totally trust it, fortunately. And that was in the fall of '83. The Soviet Union, for various reasons, was absolutely convinced that the United States and NATO, this was not known in the United States, was absolutely convinced that the U.S. and NATO were planning a first strike with nuclear weapons on the Soviet Union, which they could not survive. And they had a computer program to warn them if they got too weak that maybe they should just attack to survive. So it was in that kind of atmosphere that he's on duty one night around the middle of the night, and the console lights up and says, "Missile launch." And he looks at some of their other sensors and he doesn't see anything, but he realizes he's going to have to do something because this information goes right straight to the chief of the general staff. So he gets on the phone to his assistant and says, "That was a false alarm." And the guy says, "Got it." And just as he did that, there was a flash on the screen, 5 more missiles launched.
No.
And he had to decide right away. He couldn't check anything. And he had the courage to say, "False alarm," and hung up the phone. In that atmosphere, if he hadn't done that, and it was against his orders, he wasn't supposed to do that. He was just supposed to transmit the information, not comment on it. But if he hadn't done that, they would have for sure launched nuclear weapons on the United States and destroyed the United States, and we would have destroyed them. Now, that's the kind of situation we had in the Cold War.
That's too close for comfort.
Too close for
Entirely
comfort.
too close for comfort.
Yes.
Well, today we hear figures anywhere from 12,000 to 20,000 nuclear weapons. The Russia and the United States have the bulk of them. There are 9 nuclear states, even though a couple of them don't admit to being nuclear states, like Israel. One in particular, Israel doesn't.
Yeah.
Yes, that's right. So anyway, you look at the situation today. It costs the United States, I've seen figures, and you probably have better figures than mine, of like $125 million a day to maintain our nuclear arsenal. We are spending a huge amount on that. Plus, these arsenals are getting old, they're getting decrepit, they're getting to the point where they may go off accidentally. The Russians are talking about rebuilding. We're looking at $1 trillion bill. Now, everybody who deals with the military knows that $1 trillion will be 2 or 3 trillion before it's over. These cost overruns are just unimaginable. What should we be doing today? Should we be rethinking our nuclear strategy?
Well, now, Bill, I don't know how you are about money. Now, maybe
don't have much.
maybe you don't worry about it too much. But let me just tell you, the Cold War nuclear program cost us $8.5 trillion in 2014 dollars. And other aspects of the Cold War ran that up to a total of 15 trillion approximately that we spent on the Cold War in 2014 dollars. And then we had a disastrous war in Iraq. That cost us 3 trillion. So we're up to 18. We have a tax code that costs another trillion. That puts us at 19. And now we're talking about another trillion for nuclear weapons, weapons that we can't use except in an immense crisis, which is probably not going to happen. And in any case, we don't need so many. Just a few hundred would be enough in today's world to deter the threats that we have, maybe 300-400. And so the result of all this is that by 2020, according to the Congressional Budget Office, our annual deficit is going to be over $1 trillion.
For 1 year.
Annual.
1 year.
Annual.
Yes.
Annual. And in 2028, the combined debt of the United States will approach GDP, where economies are not supposed to go.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
So, I think we should modernize a few things, but not everything.
Mm-hmm. Do nuclear weapons make countries safer or more safe or less safe?
It depends on which country you're talking about. They make the United States much less safe. They make India much less safe. Israel, in the early days, maybe they made them safer. And the North Koreans strongly believe they would be wiped out if they weren't a nuclear state by the United States. Rightly or wrongly, that's what they believe. So there may be cases where weak states can have a sense that they can survive better with nuclear weapons, but that's the exception. Most countries are less safe with nuclear weapons, but eliminating them, that's a tall order.
Mm-hmm. Well, now we're on the Korean Peninsula. Let's stay there. This program is being taped before a supposed summit between the President of the United States and Kim Jong-un, which may or may not happen.
Yeah.
Lots could happen in the interim. But looking at the whole Korean situation, what do you recommend, or do you have suggestions on how we can defuse that particular problem? I know Bill Clinton actually cracked a deal with the North Koreans years ago. Can we look at that as sort of a prototype as to what to do today?
Well, I think Bill Clinton, it was a very different situation, but Bill Clinton had the job done, but his successor, or at least the bureaucracy of his successor, didn't want to accept anything Clinton, so they threw it all away. And North Korea started testing nuclear weapons, which they had not before. And today, I think we can be inspired by what Clinton did, but we can't do exactly what he did because it's different times. Bill Perry, who has spent many, many years negotiating with the North Koreans, former defense secretary, he says that the most we can do is to have an agreement whereby they don't do any more tests, nuclear or missile, and they don't transfer nuclear weapons or missiles to other countries. That's the only thing we can verify. North Korea is a country where you can't even verify how many they have, much less reductions. So that's the most we can do, but I don't think North Korea has any intent of attacking the U.S. Unless we attack them first. And so I don't worry too much that this will lead, their program will lead us to nuclear war. But I do think meeting with them and talking with them is the right thing to do if you understand that they can be pretty difficult to deal with.
To put it mildly. So many people are saying that there should be a total denuclearization of the peninsula. That's an ideal situation. But really, practically speaking, would Kim Jong-un ever give up his nuclear weapons?
Well, let me tell you a little story here, Bill. The North Korea favors denuclearization, and Kim has said so. But they don't think the U.S. can ever accept their conditions, so they don't maybe put it as far out in front as they otherwise might. But he said recently, and when he was with Xi, the president of China, they both confirmed that North Korea would support a policy of denuclearization in a phased and synchronous way. Now, those are the key words. And what it means is they could negotiate to stop their program, but they will not, and so they won't be making any more or testing any more, but they will keep the ones they have. And they'll only do the first, that is stop the program, maybe eliminate a few weapons, which we can't verify anyway. We have to take their word for it, when we pull out of Northeast Asia. And the sanctions, and we have to act first. That's what phased and synchronous means. So to agree with what he's proposing, that takes us to the cleaners.
It certainly does, right? Which, again, by the time this program airs, we will find out where we're moving.
Yeah, we will.
Hopefully,
we're
moving in the right direction. But
I do support meeting with them.
Yes,
strongly.
Yes, right. The only downside of this would be if there are some people who want to meet and then say if the talks collapse, then the next step is war. But war on the Korean Peninsula is one of the most unlikely scenarios as far as, I won't say unlikely in happening, but unlikely as far as people surviving because of the close proximity of Seoul.
Well, it depends on, Bill, whether you mean conventional forces or whether you mean nuclear weapons.
Even conventional.
Well, even conventional, you know, it would take many, many thousands of U.S. troops to invade North Korea and then occupy it, which is what we'd have to do to make sure they don't return to nuclear weapons. You talk about your trillions, throw in another 5.
Exactly.
And then there'd be a lot of Americans killed. And I mean, we could do that, but the American people would never support that, and they shouldn't. The idea of a so-called bloody nose, which a lot of people talk about, an airstrike on their nuclear facilities would be worse than useless. It wouldn't accomplish anything. They have caves all over the country. Who knows what is where? And a nuclear bloody nose, that could provoke a tit for tat by destroying Seoul and several million people or something like that.
And another area that's been a flashpoint for the past several years is with Iran. And of course, this whole issue of whether or not to stay in the agreement that was cracked in 2015 with the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, plus Germany and the European Union and UN involvement, which is actually held, as I understand it. This agreement has held. Iran has capped their nuclear ambitions, and that was the only goal of the program.
Yeah.
It was to shut it down for at least 10 years or perhaps longer. If, again, by the time this program airs, we will see if we're in the agreement or out. What should we do with that particular situation? How should we deal with that?
Before this agreement was signed, Iran was capable of making a nuclear weapon in a few months. And they were getting more and more expert at this and making more and more equipment and material. What was fashioned, and which no one thought was possible, it was an agreement which made it absolutely impossible for Iran to build a nuclear weapon using existing facilities or secret facilities, given all of the limitations on equipment, on the borders, monitoring their uranium mines, and all of that. So for 10 or 15 years, we didn't have to worry about that. And I mean, coming from Iran. And the agreement is very complex, and the International Atomic Energy Agency frequently says Iran is observing the agreement. And it's actually an agreement between the United Nations Security Council, for which we voted for, and not with us. We don't have, we're not really a party in the classical sense. It's between the UN and Iran. But if we pull out, then Iran will be free to ramp up their nuclear program, and they will. Europe will not reinstitute the sanctions. And it was the European worldwide sanctions that forced the agreement to begin with. They will not return. Europe will continue to trade with Iran. The U.S. will attain none of its goals. And there's just absolutely no reason whatsoever to decertify the Iranian agreement, except for some narrow, selfish, domestic political purpose, or unless you really want war.
Which would be a disaster for that whole area.
Yes.
And a lot of people argue that we already, with the invasion of Iraq in 2003, that the United States and a couple of countries basically destabilized the Middle East. You can trace a large number of the problems today, the instability, right back to that particular war.
You absolutely can.
Well, in the last minute or so that we have left, or less than a minute, what do we have? This is a very serious topic. It's a dire topic in many respects. A lot of accidents could happen. A lot of egos are involved. But what type of message do you have for our viewers as to what we should be thinking about in the future as to help deal with this problem, this whole arms control and nuclear proliferation issue?
I think, and I hope our viewers understand that nuclear weapons, as long as they exist, are a very great threat to humanity. As President Kennedy said, they're a sword of Damocles hanging over every man, woman, and child on the planet, which can be cut at any time by miscalculation, accident, or design. We should all work together to make the relevant control systems like the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the nuclear test ban, as strong as possible, and gradually move toward very low levels and maybe eventual way in the future elimination. And at the same time, we must do everything we can to combat climate change, because climate change will drive the smaller countries whose neighbors are losing their arable land or potable water to climate change, and they want to protect what they have, will drive smaller countries to break out of the Non-Proliferation Treaty and build nuclear weapons to defend what they have. So those two things the American people need to strongly support.
Well, Ambassador Thomas Graham, this is a very important topic and one that we really need to learn more about, and you've enlightened us today. I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.